Hello, everybody. A little bit of a different one. We're just going to do something slightly different from the beginning. Welcome to the Great Dynamics giveaway in celebration of Kevin's new book on the Russian FSB. We have teamed up with him to give away 2 signed copies of his new book to our listeners and the members of our community. Follow the instructions and enter our competition for the chance to win a signed copy of the Russian FSB, A Concise History of the Federal Security Service. Number 1, click on the following link to enter the competition. That is www.tropy.com/Great Dynamics. This link will be on the page in the show notes. Number 2, complete any of the 2 below to collect 100 points to give away. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, join the Great Dynamics newsletter, listen to the latest podcast with our guest and author Kevin P. and comment. Follow Great Dynamics on LinkedIn or follow Great Dynamics on Instagram. Number 3, go to the rewards tab and click on the giveaway to enter the draw. Thank you guys and enjoy the podcast. Hello everybody, thank you for joining the Great Dynamics podcast. My name is Ahmed Hassan and with me as always there's a very interesting guest. Today we are talking to Kevin Riehle. Kevin is an intelligence scholar. He has a background within academia as well as in government as an analyst and researcher. And we're going to go into a couple of his interesting work that he has done, as well as a book that is coming out on the 1st of March, I believe. And we're going to go into that a little bit more. Kevin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
So we talked a little bit before the podcast about your career, but could you take us a little bit for a ride and explain like how do you start it and how did you get where you are today?
I retired in 2021 from a 30 plus year career in the US government. And most of that time I was working in the national security community. I began in that community after graduating from my undergraduate program where I studied Russian language and political science. And my first job after graduation was as a Russian linguist. And that was about the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, or just a little before that. And when the Soviet Union did dissolve, Russian linguists were suddenly a lower priority. So I moved into some other things, and I moved into counterintelligence analysis, where I was for most of the rest of my career, looking at a variety of intelligence services, intelligence threats to U.S. and allied interests. And that is where I spent most of my career. I ended my career in academia as a professor at the National Intelligence University in the Washington, D.C. area. And then in that setting, I tried to give back some of what I learned over the years. And now that I'm retired, I am enjoying the world of academia.
Very cool. All right. And so what made you gravitate towards... Before I ask that, actually, I wanted to know, what do you prefer more, work in academia or in government? Obviously, the responsibilities are very different, but would you say that you miss it or you're happy with what you're doing now?
Well, I would say yes to both. I do miss it a bit. I mean, there are certain elements of having all the information available to you that you don't have as much when you're outside government. But there's also some freedom that comes with academia that is, after 30 years in the national security community, is nice to enjoy. So I can't say that I disliked my time in the national security community, but I am now, after I've retired from that, I'm pretty happy to be in the lower stress environment of academia and in a place where I do have the opportunity to do some writing and some publishing, where when I worked for the U.S. government, it was a little more difficult to do that.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, what I wanted to ask you earlier was, what made you decide to write and research Russian intelligence services?
Well, as I mentioned, my undergraduate degree was in Russian language, and I've had interest in Russian and the Cold War era Soviet history for a long time. I began a PhD program at King's College London about 10 years ago. And in that program, I focused on Soviet intelligence history. And that really brought me into the academic side of that discussion. And so much of my academic work has been in Russian area studies of some sort, Russian intelligence studies, even though sometimes in my professional career, I did look at some other things. But Russia has always been an area that I've been fascinated with, and particularly trying to demystify the world of Russian intelligence.
Particularly today, there's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on today, and as I mentioned, the demand for Russian linguists reduced in the 1990s, but in the past 10 years or so, Russian linguists have been in demand again. So it's nice to be one of the people that has skills of interest to those in the decision-making world.
I can imagine. So you wrote this book about the FSB, the Russian FSB, Concise History of the Federal Security Service. And I think most people that listen to the podcast will know what the FSB is, but could you tell a little bit more about the organization as well as your book and the themes it touches on?
Sure. The FSB is Russia's primary internal security service, and that is really its main mission. It has a mix of law enforcement, counterintelligence, investigative, counterintelligence operational, as well as intelligence collection responsibilities. It has reaccumulated most of the responsibilities that the Soviet-era KGB had. I say reaccumulated because during the 1990s, a lot of those missions had been broken off into other agencies. During the 1990s, post-Soviet intelligence and state security in Russia experienced a period of instability, where there were reorganizations and some period when it was in less favor with the ruling regime. But as a relatively unknown former KGB lieutenant colonel named Vladimir Putin was named the FSB director in 1998, he began to rebuild many of the pieces that had been broken off in the 1990s. And by about 2003, 2004, he had reaccumulated most of that. And so now, with a couple of exceptions, the primary human intelligence organization in Russia is the Russian Federal Foreign Intelligence Service, which also derives from the KGB, but it is a separate and independent organization from the FSB. There's also another organization called the Federal Protective Service, which is responsible for physical and political protection of the president directly and of senior leaders. That also derives from the KGB, and it is a separate and independent organization from the FSB. So those, with the exception of those couple of responsibilities, the FSB now controls pretty much all of the missions that the Soviet-era KGB had.
So for an internal security service, the FSB seems to have a rather substantial footprint outside of its borders. How does that affect, for example, the relationship with either the SVR or the GRU?
There's an element of both cooperation and competition. The FSB is but the most powerful of those organizations. It is the largest. It has, because of its internal security mission, it has a great deal of prominence in the Russian government. And it also inherited many of the intelligence collection responsibilities that the KGB had in the former Soviet states. So in the 14 non-Russian Soviet states that were previously part of the Soviet Union, the KGB of the FSB is the primary intelligence collection organization there. So that is, in the Russia's mind, somewhat of continues to be an internal security mission, because Russia does not fully respect the sovereignty of those post-Soviet states, and thus it sees it as part of Russia's domestic sphere. And thus the FSB, even as an internal security service, still has the intelligence responsibilities in those now sovereign countries outside Russia. That internal security mission also extends beyond Russia's borders. So when there is a defector or a dissident that potentially poses a threat to Russia's internal security or to the Putin regime, then that person may be pursued wherever they are in the world, but in line with that internal security mission. It's essentially extraterritorializing that internal security mission. So the mission isn't that different, even if it's being conducted elsewhere. It is just a matter of what the FSB's role is. The FSB also conducts some signals intelligence collection, which is primarily a positive intelligence mission, because it has significant control over the communications capabilities inside Russia. And as communications cross into the Russian Federation, the FSB has the ability to intercept those communications. So it is that internal security mission has a lot of pieces to it, some of which also extend beyond Russia's borders.
I mean, it's a fascinating organization, because I think loosely you could compare it to the FBI. Obviously different.
Well, actually, I talk about that in my book.
Okay.
I make that comparison. And so there's a chart I have in the book that discusses that idea of what is the FSB the equivalent to. And some people say it's the equivalent of FBI or MI5 or BFV in Germany. But in reality, it's much more than that. It has the missions that the FBI or MI5 have, but it also has the positive intelligence missions, that some of which fit within what in the US and UK context would be the National Security Agency or the Government Communications Headquarters. It has law enforcement missions that within the US context fit in a number of different federal law enforcement organizations, such as various pieces of the Department of Justice or the Securities and Exchange Commission, or even the law enforcement elements of the Environmental Protection Agency. It has Homeland Security missions. So the Coast Guard of Russia, which in the United States is part of the Department of Homeland Security, is part of the FSB. All of the border guards within Russia are part of the FSB. There are various special operations units that are part of the FSB that might be the equivalent of pieces of that are under the U.S. Department of Defense. There's also military counterintelligence, which is, in the U.S. context, part of the Department of Defense. So to really characterize the FSB, you have to pull pieces from numerous organizations in the UK or US to make a full equivalent.
Could an FSB as it exists today, could that framework and that level of responsibilities exist in a democracy?
Not likely. And one of the reasons that do exist, though, that kind of mix of organizations in the US or the UK, is because there is a concern in a democracy about any one agency having too much power. And that concern does not exist within Russia. It didn't exist during the Soviet era, when the KGB had even more functions than the FSB has now, as I mentioned earlier. But it is not a concern in Russia because, for one reason, it's not a real democracy, but also because the security of the regime is the highest priority. Anything that is going to secure the regime must be well resourced and have the power to do that. And so it becomes a very efficient organization in some ways because of that combination of responsibilities all under one boss. And there are rivalries internally as well, but no democracy would be able to sustain that sort of a reach of one organization.
Yeah. You mentioned a little bit earlier about the special operations units within the FSB, and I think the most famous one is the Alpha Group, and I think also Vympel is another one. Could you, like, especially Vympel, I don't know that much about it, but could you go into a little bit about, you know, the hierarchy and those units? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about FSB, like tactical units within, let's say, Ukraine. They are not the same as Alpha in Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Right. Alpha is primarily today a counterterrorism force. It also fits under that internal security mission of protecting the regime from external terrorist operations or internal terrorist operations in the case of Chechnya. Vympel is more a tool to use in whatever the regime needs. Vympel originated in the 1980s as part of what was called the KGB's Directorate S, which was the directorate responsible for foreign covert collection and covert sabotage operations. So Vympel has gained a name in the past few years, both for counterterrorism operations inside Russia alongside Alpha. It's also probably been involved in some external operations that for tracking down, for example, Chechen militants or Chechen propagandists who are located outside the Russian Federation, and in a few cases assassinating them. In the case of about 20 or so in the past 10 years, Vympel has been involved with assassination operations against Chechens around the world, particularly in Turkey and Europe. So Vympel is a kind of an external arm of the FSB that is an extension of that internal security mission.
That's very interesting, because that's one of the units that you don't really hear that much about. I've seen videos and images of them in Syria going after Chechens there, and I found that very interesting because they seem to behave and dress and equip a bit different than Alpha.
They probably have different equipment because of the different missions they do, yes. And they are, covert in a lot of their missions, so they will dress in a nondescript way often to maintain that covert nature. But they operate, as you mentioned, Syria, but also often heavily in Chechnya itself, but also and in Turkey quite extensively as well, for that purpose of tracking down enemies of the Putin regime.
Yeah, the reason why I'm asking you also this specifically is because I know our audience, they are super interested in these units.
Yeah.
So that's something that because it speaks to the imagination of you know what Alpha used to be of Vympel under the KGB, and that was always like the main enemy in the movies and in the books. And any student of intelligence is interested, I think, in them.
I actually saw that you had on your blog earlier a discussion of an SVR special operations unit. There are one or two. There's at least one other FSB special operations unit about which very little has been discussed, even in Russian discussions. It's only been referred to a couple of times. I mentioned it very briefly in the book, and its mission is quite cloudy. It's not really sure what its job is, but it has been praised publicly for its protection mission. So there are several of those special mission units about which very little is known.
So this one, do you have a name for this? Is there a name for this?
Well, Directorate A is Alpha. Directorate B is V is Vympel, and I think it's Directorate S under the Special Operations Service within the FSB, and there's not much information about that. What I know is in the book, and it's very, very brief.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because as you might know or not know, but on a personal level, I'm super interested in, which is even like why I took Russian lessons, to do more research on Russian organizations. And the one that you mentioned is on Zaslon. That's the SVR's protect. I think you can best compare it with the CIA's GRS.
Yes. Yeah. It is mostly.
I mean, it's hard, apples and oranges often, but
Right.
they do a more of a protective role.
Yes.
And securing of documents from embassies and accompanying
security of senior travelers when they're traveling in high threat areas and things like that.
Correct. So we're hearing a lot about, I mean, a lot. It depends, I think, how interested you are in these affairs, but the revival of SMERSH.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak to that a bit?
To understand where that's coming from, you have to understand where SMERSH originated. And your listeners probably are aware of this, but SMERSH was a World War II element. It was responsible for military counterintelligence. The name SMERSH itself was decommissioned in 1946. So there's been no organization called SMERSH in the Russian system or the Soviet system since 1946. But its main mission was to prevent Nazi penetrations of the Soviet military. It was quite successful at that during World War II. The resurrection of that name is really probably more a propaganda discussion than it is an operational one, because it allows Russia then to hark back to that World War II era and to that primary mission of SMERSH at the time, which was to fight Nazis. And it then uses that same, that kind of historical narrative to say, here's what we're doing in Ukraine today. The actual heir to SMERSH has continued to exist ever since World War II. The third chief directorate within the KGB, that after the KGB, the Military Counterintelligence Department. So the FSB has had a military counterintelligence department within it for years now. So the resurrection of the name SMERSH actually operationally changes nothing. It does, however, create an opportunity to emphasize that propaganda narrative and to heroize the Soviet efforts during World War II, particularly as directed against Nazis. So that's the real foundation of that name SMERSH today, is that it adds nothing operationally, but it does add propaganda.
That's fascinating, because what I find interesting in the war in Ukraine, and obviously this is the main theme for Putin to call it denazification, the covert units that are run from the Ukrainian military intelligence into Russia, a lot of those you could call some of those, like Russia Free Legion and these type of groups, have close ties to far right and Nazi movement. So for them then to reactivate SMERSH is an interesting one, even if it is a propaganda method.
There's a lot of parallels, no question about it. And Russia emphasizes those parallels to World War II as much as it can, because Russia portrays itself as in some ways, the lone victor of World War II. And because of that the pride that it sees in its efforts during World War II, it can use that to raise the morale and the patriotism of Russians today. So those parallels are very deliberate, and they have been quite potent amongst the Russian population.
And so we talk a lot about, and I think this falls into this whole concept of like hybrid warfare. I mean, that's the English name given to it, but where does the FSB, according to you, sit within that like larger strategic and tactical strategy of quote unquote hybrid warfare?
Well, I don't use the phrase hybrid warfare, and neither do Russians, except Russians only use that phrase when they're describing what the West does against Russia. So Russians don't really have anything that they call hybrid warfare. But where the FSB fits into the whole spectrum of activities is that it is both a collection and a covert action organization. And that's really what the phrase hybrid warfare is really all it's saying is it is a mix of tools that are used in concert with each other to achieve a political or military objective. And the FSB is one of those tools. And in Ukraine, for example, the FSB is the primary human collection organization. When you hear the Ukrainian SBU announce espionage cases, for example, in Ukraine, and there have been a lot of espionage cases inside Ukraine, the agency that they tie that case to is almost invariably the FSB. So it is used even for what look like very tactical collection missions. Missions like artillery spotting and correction, or plane spotting, or the collection, the movements of units and trains that are moving supplies, military supplies. You would think that would be a military intelligence collection mission, and thus you would probably think that will be assigned to something like the GRU, or the GU as it is now called. But in Ukraine, because of the FSB's responsibility for those activities within the former Soviet space, the FSB is the primary element there. Now, when it comes to things like hacking into military databases or hacking into infrastructure elements within Ukraine, those have mostly been the GRU. So the intelligence that leads to those, that supports those operations, some of it may come from FSB collection, but operations themselves are often conducted by the GRU. So FSB fits into that kind of whole spectrum of Russian activities that are sometimes called hybrid warfare in the West, because it has that full spectrum, or it supports that full spectrum of activities through collection and through its extension of internal security missions into Ukraine and outside the Russian Federation borders.
What do you, going back to your book, is there anything in the book that a lot of people maybe do not know about the FSB?
Well, I begin the book by talking about what the FSB, how it came to be what it is today. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of the elements that used to be in the KGB are now subordinate to the FSB. However, you can't really say that the FSB is just a KGB resurrection, because there are differences in the FSB today that you would never have seen in the KGB during the Cold War. For example, the FSB has not just used its World War II history as a source of emulation. It has actually gone back even before the Bolshevik era and has returned to discussing the counterintelligence and security police operations of the Tsarist era. And it's doing that very openly. It's not hiding that. It's using Tsarist era security officers as examples to follow. So that pre-Bolshevik era has returned as an era of study for the FSB that never would have been discussed during the Soviet era in the KGB. That would have been a taboo subject. But another thing that's happened that's changed is the removal of the communist ideology. And that has changed a number of things. One, that during the communist era, obviously the connection of state security to religion would have been unthinkable. But in the FSB today, there is a very overt connection to Russian Orthodoxy. There is a new chapel on the grounds of the FSB Academy, for example. It's a few years old now. And the Russian Orthodox Patriarch came to dedicate that chapel. It's the Russian FSB leaders very openly discuss the threats to Russia's spiritual nature, not just its political activities. So that's also something you never would have seen during the Soviet era. So that's a significant change. But also another thing that has changed within the FSB is its experiences during the 1990s, when the Russian Federation was experiencing great turmoil. Militarily, politically, and economically, Russia was crumbling. And the FSB today looks back at that period both with humiliation and with motivation, saying we will never allow that to happen again. And the very aggressive activities of the FSB within the Russian Federation, tracking down dissidents and investigating anti-regime speech, is partially a remnant of that humiliation of the 1990s, when they said we cannot allow ourselves to appear weak or to appear divided. So those are all areas where the FSB actually has evolved quite a bit outside of the old KGB.
Interesting. Because we saw obviously a break from the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Church, kind of going a different direction after the war started.
Well, that began before the war. I mean, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church received what's called autocephaly, or its ability to have its own independent patriarch. I believe it was in 2018. That was more a reaction to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the Russian support to an insurgency in eastern Ukraine. It's only become more emphasized since the full-scale invasion in 2022, but that trend towards separating Ukraine politically, culturally, religiously even, began really in force in 2014.
Interesting. Another trend that we saw, I mean, it's not a new phenomenon, but I found it interesting how much, especially in the beginning of, let's say, the second invasion of Ukraine, the role of, for the lack of a better word, Russian private military contractors like Wagner. I think some people call them semi-state formations, like Wagner and others. Could you speak to, because Wagner was more of an independent entity than, let's say, Convoy or Veteran, what was the FSB's role, and did it have any of these PMCs under its control?
First of all, Wagner was primarily connected. Most of its connections were with the GRU and less with the FSB. It used GRU training grounds, and it had a number of GRU officers that were connected with it. So the FSB wasn't the primary element for that. However, the FSB was supporting it through recruitments around the country because the FSB has an internal mission. It had the mission of going around the country and identifying potential candidates for either formal military assignments or for those private military missions as well. So the FSB has been involved in that kind of from the back end in supporting that recruitment and that identification of candidates. And for the operational end, it's probably more been the GRU. Does FSB run any organizations like that? Well, there are definitely connections between the FSB and kind of extremist right-wing militant groups in Europe. There are reports that some people from those groups have traveled to Russia for training, and that is probably connected with the FSB, at least on the training level, and possibly also with just monitoring those foreigners while they're inside Russia to make sure that they're not trying to penetrate the Russian society. So there's kind of these hands-off connections, but then there's also Russia. I mean, the FSB is responsible for some external computer-based attacks, cyber attacks, as they're called, and it will sometimes call upon private hackers to support an FSB mission. So those aren't officially private military contractors or anything like that, but they are for hire private individuals who have skills that can support the FSB's mission when necessary. So the FSB certainly is involved in that, kind of reaching out to identify all the resources that are available, whether they be for military purposes or for collection purposes. But whether FSB actually runs any private military corporations, I'm not as familiar with.
Because I think an organization that probably is very well connected with the FSB is the Night Wolves, the motorcycle gang, which is they've done operations in like Serbia and
even in Austria.
Yeah. I mean, maybe operations is too much of a stretch, but activities, let's call it that. And I think what I find fascinating about the FSB is also the connection or the hand in the Russian underworld, where a lot of organizations have to work under what they call the roof or cover of FSB. Could you go into a little bit about that?
That's an area where the FSB has a great access to just Russian businesses around the country. There are elements within the FSB that are responsible for regulating businesses and banks. They are supposedly monitoring, similar to what in the United States is called the Securities and Exchange Commission, monitoring financial securities, monitoring the bank fraud and those sorts of financial potential criminal violations. Because of that access, FSB officers have become quite notorious for using the information they have about those sometimes large financial transactions for their own personal benefit. Just for example, a few years ago, a group of FSB officers, a couple from Alpha and Vympel, as well as some Directorate K, as they're called, these banking regulation officers, were arrested. They were arrested because they essentially conducted a robbery. There was an individual they were aware of through their investigative accesses who was about to deposit in a bank a large amount of money that had been obtained through criminal means. So through their FSB accesses, they knew about this criminal investigation. They knew this large bank deposit was about to be made, and they essentially went and robbed the guy, and they took his money from him. And they used their FSB knowledge to do that, and they assumed, well, this guy's a criminal, so no one's really going to care. I mean, he's just no one's going to talk about this because that's just a criminal who's losing his ill-gotten gains. Well, it did actually come to a law enforcement matter, become a law enforcement matter. The Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is the primary kind of federal law enforcement organization in Russia, arrested these FSB officers. And it was a great embarrassment to the FSB. That access to information about financial crimes is a very tempting target for an FSB officer. Skimming off that regulatory mechanism, telling a bank that the FSB will look aside at certain bank fraud operations that are occurring if they're given just a small percentage of the gains from it. That's really tempting for an FSB officer. And there's one particular former FSB officer who now lives in the United States who essentially says that you can't be in the FSB without being a criminal, without being corrupt, because that's what the FSB's culture has become. Now, maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but there's certainly a lot of opportunity for that within the FSB. And the FSB has gained a reputation for that, particularly in the past 10 years or so.
Do you, I mean, obviously it's a difficult question I'm about to ask, but do you think that Putin, since it's kind of his organization, do you think it's condoned, or is it an embarrassment that this is the way things are now, or it's just modern Russia?
I'll give you my view on corruption inside Russia. Now, I think this is shared by some, but this is for what it's worth, my assessment of this. Corruption in Russia doesn't necessarily have the same definition as corruption elsewhere. Corruption that leads to someone enriching themselves based upon their official position in Russia is not considered criminal if that person supports the overall strategy of the Putin regime. If that person is using their resources to support the direction and the narratives of the Putin regime, then it's not considered corruption. If that person uses their resources, their riches, to counter the Putin regime, that is then corruption. So there are many people who have connections to the FSB who are now in business circles who are very rich because they have been able to use that power that comes from being associated with the FSB for their own business purposes. But because they are allies of Putin and Putin's inner circle, they are allowed to keep their riches. If they were to suddenly decide that they disagreed with Russia's war in Ukraine, or they disagreed with some other policy, they would lose it, and they would potentially be exiled, or possibly even they would end up dead. So corruption doesn't mean the same thing. It's instrumentalized within the Russian system for the purposes of advancing the Russian government direction.
I can ask you many questions about the FSB, and I think it's very, very interesting. But I also wanted to talk to you about counterintelligence as a craft, as a product, and I think it often gets short-shifted in the discussions about intelligence and also in intelligence studies. Maybe a bit difficult, but could you explain for the audience, what counterintelligence is and what its function is?
I'm actually in the process of writing another book, and it's going to be a book about counterintelligence analysis. It's a little ways off yet, but I've gone through this thought process exactly along the lines of what you're asking. To understand counterintelligence, you have to step back and understand intelligence. What is the purpose of intelligence? It is to basically support what some authors call decision advantage. It's the information that gives our decision makers better information than their counterparts abroad, so that our decisions are clearer, are better informed, and are potentially more successful at achieving our objectives than an adversaries are, because we have better information. That's what intelligence does. Counterintelligence does somewhat the opposite. The mission of counterintelligence is to prevent the adversary from gaining decision advantage over us. So that includes preventing an adversary from obtaining the information they need to inform their decision maker. It includes the prevention of our most sensitive information from reaching the adversary, because that would give the adversary decision advantage. Decisions about what we are planning, about our military plans, our diplomatic plans. If we prevent those pieces of information from getting to an adversary, we're preventing that adversary from having decision advantage. So that's that in a nutshell. I mean, it kind of in an umbrella form, that's what counterintelligence is. But that includes a lot of different things. It includes law enforcement work to arrest spies. It includes efforts to prevent our secrets from leaking, our science technology secrets or our political secrets. It includes efforts to prevent our human collection operations from being thwarted abroad. So there's a lot of things that fall under that large umbrella of preventing adversary decision advantage. And sometimes when people think about counterintelligence, they think about just those individual activities. Counterintelligence means catching spies, or counterintelligence means stopping leaks. And those are certainly part of it. But at the our overarching level, the reason for doing that is to prevent the adversary from gaining decision advantage over us.
That's a really excellent description. Thank you so much. In this phase of the podcast, I always ask the guest if they have a question for me. And before we go into the recommendations side of things. So do you have a question, Kevin?
Well, I guess I'll ask you, how did your MA in Intelligence and Security Studies at Brunel University, London, take you to where you are now? How did that facilitate your journey to where you are now?
Excellent question. And I've never been asked that before. So I think before I went to Brunel, I worked in an intelligence role, actually in a counterintelligence role. But I knew the mechanics of the work that I was doing. But I never felt that I understood the business of intelligence, or especially from an analytic perspective. And that's why I went to Brunel, because I wanted to become a better analyst and a better writer. And I think inadvertently, that goal has propelled me into starting Grey Dynamics, because I think the success of Grey Dynamics is large part because of my time at Brunel, because I really learned the value of not just analysis, but the value of good writing, the value of being concise. And I think Christian's slogan of kill your babies, and a variation of kill your darlings, and thinking about intelligence in that manner, and the way products are created. I think that has fed really into our presence online, and that in turn also got us clients. And I think it has almost become because I think I've been a very outspoken advocate of Brunel and the program there, and we've employed a lot of interns and analysts from Brunel after I left. But I think the almost religious focus on writing really well, I think that has changed. That has propelled me to and impacted me the most. I don't think, and I don't say this just because I did the program, but we've employed people from across the spectrum of intelligence studies and international relations from the US, from UK, from Europe, from Asia. And I will say the most, and I don't think people will disagree with me within Grey Dynamics when I say this, the most prepared analysts come from that program.
Well, that's a great endorsement. Thank you. And I will just piggyback on that by saying the ability to communicate your assessments in writing and orally is what makes an analyst. If you can come up with the best assessment that possibly exists, but if you can't be persuasive in how you communicate it, you can't have an impact. Well, that writing aspect is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you said it much better than I did there, but I'm more concise. No, I think also we took that concept and we even took it a step further. I spoke about this in the last podcast. It hasn't come out yet, but where in the intelligence world communities, we talk a lot about the intelligence consumer or the intelligence customer. And I think if you're writing for a consumer or a customer, then your message, outside of being well written and concise, and maybe this goes a little bit against what is taught about intelligence writing, it has to be made attractive for the consumer, and that can be done in multiple ways. But and we have really like focused on, we looked at other professions like copywriting and marketing, and how do they reach customers, and how do they break that barrier of the ever shrinking of the attention span. So a lot of our writing comes from like the basic principles of intelligence writing and briefing, but with that we have taken steps also to integrate best practices in copywriting and online writing, and writing for a different audience. I think that's something that I would also recommend to a lot of analysts to look at, to reach their customer better, because most of our customers, they don't even want to reach past the second page. So you have to catch them in those first pages.
Exactly. Yes. That's. Thank you for that.
No problem. I wanted to ask you, this is also something that we do every podcast, is do you have any cultural recommendations? So what are you listening to? What are you reading outside of your book that is coming out right now on the 1st of March? And maybe anything you're listening to or watching. It doesn't have to be intelligence related, but I always like to hear this from our guests.
Well, I'm in the middle of a book right now that I would highly recommend to anyone who is interested in the question of cyber activities. It is called Cyber War Will Not Take Place, by a professor in the United States named Thomas Rid. He has written on a number of...
I know Thomas.
Okay, maybe even interviewed him.
Yeah. No, not yet, but past life. Yeah.
But he describes better than I've ever seen the reality of what it means to operate in the computer-based world, and the probability, the damage that it can do, but at the same time, the probability of it ever turning into an actual war, the low probability of that actually happening. So that's what I'm in the middle of right now, and I would highly recommend that book.
Really good. Yeah, I've read the book, so I underwrite that. I think it's a really, I mean, all his books are good. So his book on active measures is, I think, the gold standard of anybody talking about Russian active measures.
Completely agree with you on that.
And anything else that you would like to recommend?
There's another book that I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, but there's a book that I would recommend by a BBC journalist named Gordon Carrera called Russians Among Us. And it is the best description of the 2010 arrest of Russian illegals in the United States. It became a big media story. Carrera has taken all the pieces of that story and put them together in the clearest and most accurate, I think, way that describes how illegals operate, how those particular illegals operated, what both the challenges they faced as well as the advantages that they had, and then how the whole operation fell apart in the end. So I would highly recommend that book as well, for those who are interested in the operations of Russian intelligence.
Was that Operation Ghost Stories?
Yes, the Russians Among Us. It was the title of the book, but it was about Operation Ghost Stories. Correct. Yes.
All right. I wrote it down because I want to read that myself. We did it a little bit upside down, but I wanted to, particularly because you've had a career as a practitioner as well as a scholar. A lot of people that listen to this podcast listen to it for advice. And what advice would you give either a young person that's looking to join the intelligence community, either on government side or private side, and maybe somebody who wants to make a career switch?
Well, I would probably, even without you having given the prompt for this, I would probably advise someone to learn to communicate clearly, particularly in writing. Not because you said this, but actually because that is, if you want to be clear in the intelligence world, that's what you have to do. I would also highly recommend that someone learn a foreign language, at least one, possibly more, because learning a foreign language unlocks material that you would never otherwise have access to. The book that we're talking about today, the FSB book, probably 80% of the sources in that book are in Russian language. And that's because that's where the material is. And I couldn't have written that book without reading Russian. But that is just my advantage, what I have been able to get from having a foreign language. But if you're in the intelligence world, understanding a foreign language helps you both to understand just the source data that you'll get, but also to understand who the people are and how they approach the world. And that's something I would just highly recommend to anyone to gain that skill.
Great. I obviously I second that, and we talked about it. That's why I took Russian classes. And if I may give a piece of advice, I don't know if I've ever spoken about the language learning aspect on the podcast as such. A practical piece of advice, and this is not something I found out, this is a friend of mine who told me this, is if you want to learn any language, go on websites like Fiverr or Upwork, and there's language teachers there from around the world, and do a class with 5 or 6 people and find the one that fits best with you. And that's how I found my Russian tutor. Olya, fantastic. And she's Ukrainian. And that helped me actually write the Zaslon piece, because that article, 75% of the sources is from Russian sources.
Yeah. And Russians talk a lot about their intelligence activities publicly, and much of it is not translated into English. So your example, the Zaslon organization, but also just a lot of, if you want to read about Russian intelligence, you a lot of times have to go to Russian sources.
Yeah. And I would add to that, and I know I'm going to make a bit of enemies, even among friends, that it's really hard to take you seriously as a expert if you don't speak the language of the place that you're an expert of.
And there are people who have been able to sell themselves pretty well, have been able to get along okay, but it does boost your ability to create, to have credibility. Yes.
Yeah, Kevin, thank you so much. This was a fascinating podcast, and I am a fan of the work that you do, and anything actually Russian security services I'm super interested in. Funny story. My father is a former counterintelligence officer, and he was trained by the KGB as a young man before, when Somalia was an ally of the Soviet Union. And the funny thing is that when that relationship broke, he was trained by the CIA. So that's a very interesting career, and he talks about it very fondly.
Sounds like you need to write a book about your father.
Yeah, I should. Problem is, he never really wants to talk about anything on record. So if I ever write it, he told me that I can only publish it after he's gone. So, but I don't want to do that. So, but thank you again. I really appreciate it. That I think this was really an awesome podcast, and I've learned things that I thought I knew. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Happy to do it. Thank you for the invitation.
And for anybody listening, we will put the information on Kevin's book in the show notes. And if you made it this far, as I say every week, give us a review and let us know what you think. And I think, Kevin, I'm going to ask you back to talk more about counterintelligence the next time, because I have a lot of questions on that. And thank you again, and talk to you guys the next time. Cheers.